and you can take notes in the columns and stuff like that to refer back to. So if you would have your seats again, we'll get started. We're slightly ahead of time, but I think that's good because I now begin to tell some of my stories. This next section is important because when we talk about military culture, we understand that we're ministering to a very broad range of generations, and they're different. We talk about veteran generations, we're talking about people who are age 17 or 18, all the way up to folks who are in their mid and late 90s. We talk about different generations. We talk about World War II. World War II is considered to be a success. It was been referred to as the greatest generation. There are a few folks who do remain from World War II. There were parades, and they were silent sufferers. I'll mention that again in a moment. Korea was considered to be a police action. Very difficult campaign. It was considered to be a stalemate. And there are a few folks who remained from the Korean campaign. There were weak thanks given. In fact, they are kind of considered to be the forgotten veteran. In Vietnam, which is another generation, Vietnam was considered to be a loss. There was no thanks, and returning veterans were often disparaged, called names, spit upon, ostracized, somewhat hated. Many couldn't return. When they returned, couldn't wait to take the uniform off, let their hair grow, and kind of disappear into the common population. But they were hurt. In the Cold War, it was an endless cycle of being ready, of being trained. There were many who served 20 or more years in service, never deployed. They retired after 20, but they're not considered to be veterans. Post 9/11 has been a long and continuous, arduous campaign in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and other places, and continues today. Vets today are thanked far more than those who were in the previous generations, except perhaps World War II veterans. Very different. And we talk about two of those generations specifically. In Vietnam, it was a war fought by the sons of World War II. It was a very kinetic war. There were many casualties. Over 58,000 were killed in the Vietnam War. It was a draft military, and that's a very different culture of being forced to serve as opposed to the volunteer force we have today. And that affects the culture. I met a gentleman a few months ago in one of our congregations who was a scout. And in the Army, the scout is one of the riskier professions you can possibly be. Because basically your job is you go out with a couple of other folks and you penetrate the enemy's perimeter. Try to find out how many of the enemy there are, what kind of equipment they are, and so forth. It's a very dangerous occupation. And when I thanked him for that, and especially to taking upon himself that extra risk, you know what his response was? It was mind-boggling to me. He says, well, I preferred that because you can never, in the draft army, you never knew who you could trust. But you could trust those who were with you as scouts. In the draft military, you didn't know if your companion, if your battle buddy had your back. It was a draft military and there were few women involved. It was an asymmetrical guerrilla war that was fought in a World War II traditional mode. And as I mentioned, they were disparaged for their service. Many have kept that in. And a couple of years ago, I was giving a presentation like this to one of our churches in Florida. And there was about a dozen men who were gathered for this, had a nice breakfast and so forth. And I was giving the presentation, and somewhere along the line, one of the veterans, when I came to a point like this, he paused and he shared one of his experiences in Vietnam. And he went on to talk about that very personal, deep hurt that he had as a result of that experience and never really being able to talk about it. He felt at that time that he was within a safe, trusting environment, just within those group of men. I don't know if they knew themselves. They probably knew of each other, but I know they didn't share like this. And he began to cry. And those other men came around him and supported him. And they thanked him for his courage and for his service. One of the ways we can be most helpful in our ministry to folks who are in the armed forces, especially Vietnam vets, is to thank them for their service. That you appreciate, say it out loud, that you appreciate the sacrifice they made. And that goes true for everything, for sure. But especially for the vet from Vietnam. They need to hear that. On Veterans Day, I spoke at a luncheon on Veterans Day honoring veterans. And it was a nice affair, and I gave my speech and so forth. And a woman came up to me who was not a member of the congregation. And she had brought her father, who was a Vietnam vet. And she thanked me profusely. She said her father told her that that was the first time anybody had ever expressed appreciation for his service. Yes, please. Okay, yes. Somebody got the mic? Okay. We have Dave with the mic. He's not.
It's not that important. I need a microphone. Of course, World War II was also draft after the initial. But I realized a different scenario that was viewed more as this is a matter of survival. Whereas Vietnam was, we're trying to contain communist expansion, so a different mentality was there. And if there were individuals during World War II, which I'm sure there were, that were pacifists, they were the ones who were excluded mostly from the conversation. Whereas during Vietnam, the pacifists were the ones that were given the microphones and the media and so forth.
Good point. Yeah, let me talk. Let me go back to a couple of things about the World War II. They were silent sufferers. When we talk today about post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're different. In World War II, after you were finished with your combat, there were safe lines. I mean, after you completed your combat duty, you know, there was a period of time you spent in the unit over there. Then you boarded a ship, and then that took, you know, a few days, a week or two or something. Then you came into a unit over here and were put into that unit to decompress and so forth, to exit the military. That time that they had with their buddies who shared that experience gave them some opportunity to decompress and to share some of the painful stuff. Sometimes, often. That's very different than when you board a plane in Iraq and and 24, 25, 30 hours later, you're back in the homeland. You're outside of your network of safety and support, and you come home to an entirely different environment. That's important. In World War II, there were also silent sufferers, and I've got an example. My uncle was in the Army in World War II, and he was in Italy, and he was captured. And he was put in a concentration camp outside of Munich, Stalag something or other. And he was there for, you know, quite a while. I think it was a little less than a year before he was liberated. And that's a whole other sequence of, we can talk about that for hours. At any rate, he expressed very explicitly to his wife, and to his children, and to, you know, he's my uncle, so to us as well, my brother and I, and so forth. We were never to ask him about his military experience. We were forbidden to do that. He didn't even share that with his own wife or his own personal family. Never. So it was off the table. Fast forward a few years, and my daughter is in high school, and she was given an assignment to interview someone about their military experience. And I said, well, you know, I don't have anything great to report, but why don't you write a letter to Uncle Fred and ask him and see if he would share. And to everybody's amazement, he wrote back a story of something that happened to him in the concentration camp. The very first time, and that was like 40 years later, the very first time. It took that long for him to process that and to feel free enough to be able to talk about something that was painful. That began, and his own daughters were amazed that he talked about it. And his own daughters then talked more freely about that with him and put together a little booklet composed of his experiences. Sometimes you just have to be patient and wait till that person is ready to share that kind of painful stuff. But what it requires is a culture or a relationship that is trusting and that feels safe to that soldier. And I've got more to say about that later. Whoops. Let me talk a little bit about the OEF veteran. OEF and OIF veteran. In this current modality of combat, there are no front lines. There's no place to escape back to. There's a lot of anxiety and stress. There's hypervigilance. And there's very little respite. When I came back from my deployment, now nobody shot at me. I was 1,000 miles away from where a lot of that combat was taken. I was in a higher headquarters. I was a deputy command chaplain of Combined Forces Land Component Command. And nobody ever shot at me, but we went through training. I mean, danger was all about, and you had to have your wits about you. So I come home from my deployment, and like in many instances, there are lots of honeydew things on that list that have been building up for a year. So what do you do when you have a honeydew list, right? You go to Home Depot, someplace like that. So I went to Home Depot to pick up the supplies and so forth. I come back out, I whip out my flashlight, and I look under the wheel wells, I look under the trunk, I look in the grill and so forth, my flashlight, just as I always had. And I did that without thinking. Now that's just a small token that the anxiety and the stress of being in a combat zone like we have today imposes upon that participant. It's just a small thing. I realized, hey, I don't have to do this anymore. But if you live in an environment where you can't trust what's going on, and you always have to have your wits about you, you can't turn that off like you can turn off a water spigot. And those of you who are parents or grandparents of soldiers, especially if they're coming back from a deployment, you've got to keep that in mind. You just can't turn it off quickly. So the OAF and OIF veteran often experiences hypervigilance and stress. It's an all-volunteer force. That's a big difference from having been drafted. There's large use of reserves. I could tell by the early 2000, that we were running out of chaplains. Pretty much any chaplain who was able to be deployed was either in the process of or was already deployed. And I'm not just talking about Missouri Synod folks. I'm talking about the whole Army chaplaincy. We were digging deep into the reserves. Women are integrated into total force like never before. And the connectivity, as I mentioned before, by internet and phone is tremendous. And that's both good and bad. And I think sometimes it's more bad than good, because the problems at home can seep in very quickly, can come and grab the attention of the combatant and be a distraction for the accomplishment of his mission. Has anybody seen American Sniper? Yeah. All right. That is a great example. That's a great example of the culture in the military that we have now, where you have someone talking to his wife while somebody's shooting at him. You know? She's upset, he is upset, and he's in great danger as a result. There's better medical treatment. There are fewer casualties. There are many more survivors, and it's a highly technical operation. Let me talk a little bit about the effects of military service. Military service, the effects are very real for not only the combatant, for the soldier, but also for this family, both immediate and extended. For example, there are sacrifices, there are casualties, there are wounds, there are stresses. And I want to point out, and it's important for us to understand in our ministry, that the entire family system is stressed. If you're a pastor of a congregation and you have a congregant who is a grandparent or a parent of someone who's deployed, you need to pay a little, I would encourage you, I'm going to tell you what to do, but I would encourage you to pay a little extra attention, pastoral care sake, to that parent and grandparent, because they're worried. They're concerned. And that's an opportunity for ministry. And if you were to encounter someone in your realm who is a parent or grandparent or whatever, thank them for their service and sacrifice as well for supporting that service member. Thank them as well. There have been numerous occasions in which I have heard parents talk about their son who's returned, their Marine who's returned from combat, has gotten out of Marineship, out of the Marines, and now is living in their basement and can't seem to hold a job. He can't seem to find himself. So imagine yourself if you're online at the grocery store and there's some people talking in front of you, talking about, what to do about David, whatever, who's in the basement. And you happen to overhear this. One opportunity for us is so simple. Is to say, I couldn't help but overhear, I want to thank you for your service. Thank you for his service. And thank you for your support. Do you mind if we pray, if I prayed for him tonight? What is his first name? Or would you mind if our congregation prayed for him and for you? That's all it takes. Saying thank you. Can we pray for you? Yes, sir.
Three comments. The three observations I like to make. Number one, as far as Vietnam vets go, I am one. And one thing I think a lot of people need to understand is that retirement leads to new crises for Vietnam vets. In the first half of 2014, over 225 Vietnam vets contacted the VA for help because they were falling apart emotionally.
Yep.
I fell apart in 2014 through 2016, and I finally got the help I needed. And we need to be very sensitive because burying these thoughts is a horrible thing to do. My dad was a Navy corpsman in World War II, fought with the Marines in Guam and Bougainville. It wasn't until I encouraged him to start talking about what he went through that he finally decompressed and was able to enjoy the last few years of his life. Because before that, all he used was humor and alcohol to try to bury what he had experienced. And we need to encourage the vets to speak up and talk about what they went through.
Excellent.
Other thing, I'm sorry, we talked about it. Last thing is thanks. It is very important. It is only because of Iraq and Afghanistan that Korean and Vietnam vets ended up getting thanked. Nobody said boo to us for so many years. I'd like to share this with you. I don't want to take a lot of time, but I was in a Costco parking lot back in 2008, and I went on, there was a little card on my windshield that said, I want to thank you for your service. I said, well, that's nice. And the guy came over because he was still there, and he said, I want to personally thank you. And I started crying. I cried for 10 minutes. Nobody had said thank you. All I had to put up with is criticism, snide comments all my life about my service.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for your service. And we talk about sacrifices and casualties. That doesn't just go away. It's often born throughout our lives. Your care, your encouragement can mean all the difference. And while we talk about sacrifices, I need to also remind ourselves that service in the military can also be a tremendous opportunity for growth. Personal growth, growth of faith. There are many soldiers I have seen come to faith or renew their faith as a result while they're out in country XYZ serving, and they really start to deal with the hard questions about life. They're at a crossroads. And a little encouragement and a little thank you goes a long way in helping to develop and come to faith and to the hope that Jesus offers us. My point here is that every individual and family system are changed. And those changes last a lifetime. There are wounds, as I mentioned, there are physical wounds. Some of the ones that you've heard more recently are traumatic brain injury, loss of some function. There are psychological wounds. We talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. Many Vietnam veterans still carry that. And there are suicides. The current statistics indicate that there are approximately 20 suicides a day by veterans. 20 a day. That's huge. 20 a day. What really got me was that 69% of those suicides are committed by folks over the age of 55. And I would ask the church, what does that mean? What I hear in that great sadness and tragedy of folks who feel very hopeless. And these are folks who are embedded in our communities, who are online with us in the grocery store, or when we're having our tires rotated or whatever. You may be near one. And therein lies a great opportunity for us as people of faith to care for and encourage another. They're not going to come knocking on Pastor Tom's door and say, you know, Tom, I'm really thinking taking my life. That's not going to happen. Remotely, perhaps. Occasionally it does. But more likely, it's the layperson of the congregation who's sitting next to and in the sphere of influence, maybe even in some of your own friend networks, who's part of that statistic, or currently is a part of that statistic. And I thought to myself, well, why is that? Why would it be over 55? I don't have the answer, and I've not known of many studies that did, but I'm thinking. And the Gary Danielson idea is that suicide is often is hopelessness, and one of the key ingredients of suicide is loss of relationship, loss of significant relationship, death of a spouse, divorce, or something of that nature. Maybe it's also a loss of physical functioning. Yes, sir.
Tired of hurt.
Tired of hurt.
Got pain and get rid of it.
Right.
They got a jar full of opioids and say, I don't want to live like this.
Right.
Who's going to know?
Who's going to know? Who cares?
Yeah.
What is, and loss of purpose. Loss of a sense of purpose in life, and maybe loss of identity. You know, someone retires from the military or gets out of the military, and nobody salutes you anymore, or greets you with good morning. I was at an LWML convention not long ago, and I was online for breakfast, and in the military there's a common culture of saying good morning. There was when I was in. And you greet if you're passing somebody, if you're online with somebody or whatever, good morning. How are you this morning? Or whatever. Usually it's just a good morning. And this is kind of a greeting. Well, I was online at breakfast and I said, well, good morning. He turns around and says, do I know you? He's surprised that somebody's that friendly or respectful. And sometimes when you get out of the military, you lose a lot of that sense of respect and honor and a sense of purpose. You're connected in the military not just with a job, but with a grand purpose of serving our nation, of protecting our population, and now you're separated from that. So loss of identity, loss of purpose, loss of relationship, loss of physical capabilities or something like that. And I think that many folks in the military who are more commonly decision makers. You know, let's go and do it. They're also more familiar with firearms. And if they also have a component that is impulsive, there you go. Maybe there's a loss of relationship with children. They've moved away, they don't call anymore, so forth and so on. What I'm getting at is that therein lies an opportunity for good pastoral care in the name of Jesus Christ as a result of God's love for us in Jesus Christ to care for another human being. All it takes is some listening ears. And what I'm doing today is basically sharpening your antenna. I don't expect you to remember all this, but maybe your antennas now are a little more sensitive to hearing some of the maybe more oblique language that is being utilized when someone is in pain. In addition to psychological wounds, there are also spiritual and moral wounds. What would be a moral wound? Anybody? Please?
You're in combat, you're in firefight, and each got each other's back, you're doing something else, and what he gets. So that's you let him down.
Right.
Inside.
Letting down your buddy?
Let your friend down.
Yep. American Sniper had a great vignette. Or let me just say this. Let's say you're Lieutenant Brad. I'm sorry, I don't know what your name is, but this lieutenant, what's your name? Tom. Todd. First Lieutenant Todd is given the task to move part of the company from one place in Iraq to another place in Iraq. You're going to be responsible for the convoy. You make sure all the trucks and all the soldiers are loaded up properly, that they're spaced out accordingly, but you're going to be passing through several villages on the way. And these villages are multi-storied, ideal for an ambush. So, Commander Todd, commander of that convoy, he gives the instruction, you don't stop for anything. Because if we stop in the middle of a village, we're going to be toast. And Lieutenant Todd is responsible for the lives of those 50 soldiers who were in this convoy. Now a woman jumps out in one of the villages, jumps out in front of his convoy. Does he stop? Does he plow through? Therein lies a moral wound, in addition to the kind of wound you're talking about. Because we all have the sense of fairness. This is wrong. That person may or may not have had a bomb strapped to them. Maybe they were just going out and getting muffins. I don't know. But you cannot afford to risk the lives of those in your company by stopping in the middle of a canyon filled with walls. That's a moral wound. And there are many instances like that, where a soldier may come back with a moral wound. There are other kinds of sacrifices as well. There are social sacrifices in terms of giving up relationships, cutting relationships off. Especially in the reserves, there may be economic sacrifices, especially job. You know, every person coming back from deployment or getting in the reserves, coming back into the civilian life, is supposed to have a job, have his job back. That doesn't always work out so well. He may come back to his job and he finds that the friend that the buddy that he was on the job with before he left is now a supervisor. Many come back and find difficult, or when they get out, find it difficult in translating their newly acquired skills in the military to civilian world. and may have difficulty. You know, if you're, and I have one of my wife's great grandsons had that problem. He came back he was in infantry. Well, you know, there's not a whole lot of jobs in Saline that calls for an infantryman. And so there may be some difficulty in his acquiring employment. You know? And so it's important that we be sensitive to and find ways, and I think we have an employment, so you hire me.
Yes.
Yes, here. Hire Michigan vets. All, you know that there are organizations like that is important in your helping and encouraging someone in that transition. There are adjustments basically to what we call a new normal. Returning vets experience, as I mentioned, anxiety, depression, disorientation. When I came back, I felt I was like 2 feet left of center. Everything seemed the same, but everything seemed to be different. There's grief, loss of friends, morality, faith. There's substance abuse, adjustment problems, relationship issues of family. Sometimes domestic violence occurs and may occur more often. There are, as I mentioned, suicides, and the suicide rate for active duty folks is on the rise. Combat transforms all who participates. The combination of camaraderie, of danger, and of boredom forges powerful bonds between veterans. As I mentioned earlier, those bonds sometimes replace the power of the relationship with family. And so when they are devoid of those relationships, and come back into the civilian world, it's difficult. There may be some trips, and I mean tripping, they're not easily adjusted to. As I mentioned, the present day combat, there's a pace of operations, there's no downtime, there are a number of deployments. My ex-son-in-law is on his 6th deployment. He was married to my daughter for 10 years, and he was deployed 6 times. So basically, they were only together for about 3.5 years out of that 10. There's a constant exposure to fire, and driving is dangerous, as I illustrated before. And so returning vets have to reset themselves to civilian life. There's grief and transition processing that has to occur. There's learning and unlearning, relearning basic skills. There's the redevelopment of a community support system. There's re-engaging civilian moral codes. If you remember from, those of you who have seen American Sniper, the language that is used between battle buddies, team members, can be very different in terms of, or it needs to be, if he brings that home, there's trouble. He can't talk to his wife and his children like he did with his battle buddies. Families also have to reset themselves. And that is, they need to become reacquainted amidst high expectations. There's a redefining and adjusting of roles. There are financial issues. Sometimes, I remember living in Norfolk, and I knew when the fleet was coming back in, because every car dealer and truck dealer had big sales and were just hovering, waiting for the returning sailors. The sailor has been, aboard a vessel for 6 to 9 months, and he's been thinking, boy, when I get back out of this and get off of this doggone ship, I'm going to buy me the best pickup truck I can lay my eyes on. Whether or not it's good for family or not, doesn't matter. He's going to get that pickup truck. And so sometimes families get into trouble not realizing that the extra pay that they receive should go to as an investment in the family rather than investment in a pickup truck. There's a loss of common history. There are often intimacy and attachment issues. And just renewing relationships, especially with children, can be a real challenge for a returning service member, whether it's male or female. It's also, on the other side, an opportunity for growth. Many families discover a new resiliency. And if you happen to be talking with a family member who's sharing their struggles, also listen for the resiliency that they have experienced during that period of time. Help them to see how they have grown. Many acquire a new spiritual life, many grow emotionally, many develop skills and capabilities that they hadn't had before, and many become more economically secure. This slide's going to be on the test. It's an important slide. Service members and their families are not broken. They are not broken. They want respect, not pity. They are not victims, and often Hollywood wants to portray Vietnam veterans as a political victim. They are not victims. They're proud of their service. They want to be honored, not glorified. They want to be appreciated. They want and need to be thanked. They need to be accepted and understood with patience and trust. Now, I should probably add to that, in a non-judgmental way. Before I move on, are there any questions or comments at this point? I thank you so much for your listening and your engagement, sharing of your own personal experiences. That's very, very important. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about Operation Barnabas as a program or as an effort. It's God's working through us. God's love working through us. Our role as an individual, and I think as a congregation, is to create an environment, create a culture of care. A culture that promotes trust and that feels safe. And I speak about this not just for veterans and service members. In general, people need to feel comfortable and not being judged. We need to create a culture that respects and values service members and their families. I'm getting some echo here. I think it's a little bit, we turn back the modulating microphone, whoever's in charge of that. Also to engage and to listen. God will give you the words. Pastor Carey and I were talking at the break that sometimes when we preach, we think we really blew it. Just couldn't find the words, not sure we really had a point worth anything. Repeated a lot of God language, and after the sermon we sit down and, God, forgive me. That was not my best. And then after the service, someone will come up to him and say, Pastor, that's the best thing I ever heard. I really needed to hear that. My point in saying that is that don't worry about what to say. The Spirit will use you. And even if you say the wrong thing, no big thing. God will use your heart, your relationship with that other person to promote strength and healing. The Spirit will use you. Trust the Holy Spirit. Engage and listen. We are to inquire gently, show interest. Express solidarity, empathy, and care. We don't pump with questions. We may want to ask an open question. I love that someone over here mentioned that. Well, what do you think about? A person illustrated about baptism. He said, well, what do you think about that?
Oh, that was the chaplain asked my grandson.
Right, okay.
And there's a whole bunch of Marines, and they're all, my grandson was a crew chief on a CH-53 Super Battalion.
Yeah, but see, it's the openness of that question.
Yeah.
You know, what you told me about this, that, or the other thing. I said, well, what do you think about it? Or, how do you feel, how did that make you feel at the time? Or, how has that affected you? An open question. I don't know if this congregation is involved with Stevens Ministers or not. It's a wonderful program that trains folks on how to listen. But the idea of that is to ask questions that are open-ended. Expressing solidarity, empathy, and care. Even if you don't agree with the person, or you feel the person is, well, you're afraid of flying, how can I? I'm not there. You've got to trust that person, that what they're talking about is felt by them. Express empathy and care. Basically, my concept is that healing and growth best occurs within a context of caring relationships. What is a congregation? It's that context of caring relationships. Well, how? How do we do this? Well, God works through us. He works through people and congregations and organizations to honor and thank vets, to help identify their needs, partner with others, and develop opportunities for services and supports, to celebrate God's love and mercy as His family. So what do we do to get started? If you have not done any of, if you're interested in getting something started that honors and respects vets, let me suggest the following. Establish an OB committee. Maybe it's 2 people. Maybe it's 3 people. I don't know. Maybe you meet regularly. Maybe you meet, when you need it, when needed. Work with the pastor. Maybe you want to identify who are the veterans in your congregation, past and present. That's a good place to start. And also in the community. Used to be that when I was in the Florida-Georgia district and I was in specialized ministry, which is kind of a missionary type of ministry, every now and then, about once every 3 or maybe every 4 or 5 months, I would get a card from the district office that would say, well, we and the district staff prayed for you today, for your welfare and so forth and so on. And I felt very touched by that, because I felt somebody really cared for me. Can you imagine a soldier out on the berm doing pulling guard duty, staring at sand for 8 to 10 hours a day? And he gets a card from home, from his congregation, that said, we prayed for you and your welfare today. Letting God's love flow through you is not all that hard. It takes a little effort, yeah. But just expressing that kind of thankfulness and prayer can mean a whole lot to individuals who are out there. Identify family members of vets and service members. Are there parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters in your congregation whose family member is serving or has served and is in trouble? Identify veteran community organizations, and we have a couple here. The bank, PNC, is here. We have Higher Vets, Michigan Vets, and I think there's the Buddy, who are here. Partner with them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Share your resources, share your love and care for other people with these other organizations. And identify local military installations and units in your area. I passed an armor here it's somewhere in the area. There are armories of reservists, National Guard armories. Get to know what's kind of in your community. Getting started, I would suggest that you include prayers for our nation's service members and their families regularly or frequently, maybe including them in your newsletter, and many congregations do that. Maintain contact with your service members. Very important. Send them an email once in a while, or a card, or something. You may want to consider conducting a vet recognition ceremony, and I think you do that already here at Christ our King. Service members sending and receiving ceremony. One of our strengths is our worship, and let's include, a current personal need in the context of what we do best, and send that service member off with a blessing. Receive them back with a blessing and with thanksgiving, and celebrate their return. Participate and publicize community veterans events. You may want to consider a static display in the narthex or on a wall somewhere in a hall of veterans who have served, past and present. Maybe you want to consider care packages. That's also a possibility. If you're doing many of these things, you may want to consider enhancing your outreach to our military personnel by developing further those relationships in the congregation and in the community. Maybe there's a need for a support group. I was mentioning last night that I gave a presentation like this to a church out in Sanibel Island in Florida. And the average income there is 1.2, 1.4 million per household. The average age is 82. There is a lot of snowbirds that kind of come and go. And so that's kind of a unique, kind of setting. But knowing that, there's a lot of widows there and widowers. Maybe you could help support them in their grief. Maybe there's a need for help with depression or providing funeral support. Identifying vets and spouses, relatives of. You may want to take a look at what VA and civilian medical facilities are around that serve veterans, hospitals and clinics and domiciliary care facilities. There are other vet organizations such as the VA. There's the honor flight support. Everybody know what an honor flight is? It's where they fly fly veterans of World War II and also Korean and Vietnam vets to the war memorials in Washington, D.C. And we have congregations who participate in that, who help get folks on the plane, who may go with them, and other congregations who then receive them back. It's kind of a one-day deal. There's the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars. There are other local veterans groups, and maybe you want to partner with other congregations. There's a ministry through Lutheran Church Charities called the Canine Care Dog, Comfort Dog Ministry. There are comfort dogs that are specially trained to work with veterans called Care9 dogs. And there are other centers of care for veterans, independent living, assisted living, adult daycare, hospice, rehab, and social services, too, may know of veterans who need care. But a little inquiry, a little asking a few questions. Folks in social services can do a lot. They may be able to guide you. Hospices are often looking for help in supporting veterans. It's basically building relationships. The relationships that are characterized by trust, understanding that family is important and being family, understanding the hierarchy involved in the military and the sense of mission and purpose and how important that is to someone in the military, to all of us, really. It is said that the gift that you can give a veteran is to be a friend. Whether you call him a battle buddy or a shipmate or wingman, be a friend. And provide that an opportunity for that veteran to participate in the job. I have spoken to veterans who said, you know, don't invite me to a meeting. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. I'll show up. You need help with providing a playground for your preschool? I'm there. When they're ready, invite them to a study, a Bible study. And again, when they're ready, to a worship service. So we honor and thank veterans through prayers, worship service, displays, events, emails, and notes, and as I mentioned earlier, adopt a chaplain. This is some examples of displays that I've encountered across our nation.